A black CEO was kicked from first class by a flight attendant, but he landed on his feet, and one calm sentence left the entire crew speechless. He was kicked from first class by a flight attendant, thinking humiliation would stick. He didn't know the man he shoved could land on his feet and strike with words sharper than fists. Subscribe if you believe true power doesn't need violence to punish arrogance. The man in Seat 1A did not flinch when the flight attendant's shadow fell over him. Darian Crosswell had just secured the latch on his briefcase beneath the seat and pulled his tablet to review one final document, an encrypted briefing on the emergency response protocol he was set to unveil the following morning. His fingers tapped with surgical precision, the green glow of classified schematics casting faint reflections on the cabin wall. Around him, the first-class compartment of Astroflight 918 buzzed quietly with the rhythm of boarding. Low conversation, rustling carry-ons, the occasional ding of an overhead bin snapping shut. But near row 1, the air shifted. "Excuse me, sir," a voice interrupted, flat, devoid of courtesy. Darian looked up, calm but curious. The attendant standing over him, tall, pale, clipboard clutched like a baton, was not smiling. "Your boarding pass?" the man asked. Darian blinked once. He had already scanned it at the gate, smiled at the steward stationed near the boarding door, even nodded politely to the same attendant as he passed. Still, he reached into his jacket pocket, withdrew the crisp pass, and handed it over. "Seat 1A. Crosswell, Darian," he said evenly, watching the man's reaction. The attendant didn't read the pass. He barely glanced. Instead, he studied Darian's face with a coldness that didn't match the moment, as if trying to decide whether he liked what he saw. "Thank you," he said tightly, handing it back. He didn't move. Darian shifted slightly, sensing the pause wasn't logistical. The man's name tag caught the dim overhead light, Corin Vale. The clipboard in his hands wasn't a manifest. Darian could tell by the angled notches near the top it was a crew assessment form. That made the stare down all the stranger. "Everything all right?" Darian asked, voice neutral. Corin didn't respond at first. He glanced toward the cockpit, then down at his clipboard again. A beat passed, too long for comfort. Then he nodded without looking Darian in the eye and stepped away. Darian exhaled quietly and returned to his screen, but the interaction lingered in his mind. He'd flown hundreds of routes. Attendants came in all forms, strict, relaxed, cheerful, cold, but there was something else under Corin's skin. Not irritation, tension. Across the aisle, another attendant, leaner, younger, olive-skinned, watched the exchange with furrowed brows. Darian caught his eye briefly. The attendant gave a quick nod as if to say, "I saw that too," before turning to help a passenger stow a suitcase. His name badge read Jaren. The engines began to hum with increased pitch, the final boarding call announced, and overhead bins sealed shut. Darian finished his notes, encrypted the file again, and leaned back. The leather of the seat creaked softly. His body was tired but disciplined, his posture reflecting years of public presence and boardroom command. All he wanted was rest. A quiet flight home. He had an early morning ahead, a press briefing that would introduce Veronis Systems' latest innovation to the world, a real-time threat response system for aviation emergencies. Months of field testing, closed-door approvals, and near-sleepless nights had led to this moment. He closed his eyes, letting the hum of the engine settle around him. But just before the safety demonstration began, he felt it again, that shadow. Corin had returned. This time he was closer, clipboard still in hand, but his expression had changed, tighter, as if he was waiting for a reason to escalate something. Darian didn't move. His eyes remained closed, but his senses sharpened. The sound of Corin's pen tapping once, twice against the clipboard. A faint whisper exchanged between crew members near the curtain, and the subtle click of a radio on someone's hip. He opened his eyes slowly. Corin was staring at him again, but this time it wasn't idle scrutiny. It was like he'd made a decision and was just waiting for permission to act on it. Darian followed his gaze. Corrin kept flicking his eyes toward the cockpit door, almost like he was confirming something, or waiting for a signal. Darian's jaw tightened slightly. The cabin lights dimmed in preparation for takeoff, casting golden shadows on the walls. Outside the windows, the runway stretched into darkness. A crew member closed the cabin door with a hollow thunk. As the lock slid into place, Darian heard a voice in his mind, not imagination, but memory. His own voice, from a company training module he once narrated, "Protocol integrity begins the moment the cabin door seals. Nothing changes after that. No reassignment, no relocation, no excuses." And yet, here was Corrin, waiting, watching, plotting something that wasn't supposed to happen. Darian's gut stirred, but his face remained composed. Jaren passed by again, offering a fleeting look of apology that he didn't voice aloud. Darian nodded once in silent reply. The engines roared louder as the aircraft began to taxi. Safety announcements echoed through the speaker system. But near the front of the plane, a different kind of turbulence was gathering. Darian settled back into his seat, eyes alert now. Every fiber of him sensed it. Something wrong was about to unfold. Something designed. Something personal. And as he fastened his belt with a soft metallic click, the thought crystallized in his mind. This wasn't a routine flight. It was a stage being set. His fingers curled around the armrest. His pulse slowed, not out of fear, but focus. Whoever Corrin was, whatever he thought he could control, he had no idea who was sitting in seat 1A. This flight is not what it seems. Your seat has been reassigned. The words landed louder than expected, slicing through the hum of settling passengers and rustling carry-ons. Darian Crosswell looked up, blinking once, registering the sharp tone in flight attendant Corrin Vale's voice. The man stood rigid beside him, arms stiff at his sides, voice projecting just enough to draw attention from the first few rows of the cabin. Darian's fingers paused mid-scroll on his tablet, the Veironi Systems logo softly glowing on the screen. He set it down. "Excuse me?" he asked, voice even, calm. "There's been an unexpected protocol revision," Corrin declared with a clipped efficiency that rang hollow. "You'll need to move from this seat. Stand immediately." Passengers nearby slowed their movements, glancing sideways. Darian's brow furrowed. He reached into the inner pocket of his blazer and pulled out his boarding pass, still crisp from check-in. He held it up without raising his voice. Seat 1A. Assigned, scanned, and confirmed at the gate. Corrin's lip curled slightly, but his eyes didn't flicker down to the boarding pass. Instead, he took a half-step closer, just enough to make the moment feel charged. "Sir, I need you to comply. Now." Darian sat still, posture relaxed but alert. He studied Corrin's face, the tight jaw, the narrowed gaze, the tension in his shoulders. Something about the performance felt rehearsed, as if Corrin had practiced this escalation before. "I'm asking for clarification," Darian said, his voice still controlled. "And I'd like to speak with the crew supervisor. This doesn't align with safety protocol." At the rear of the first-class cabin, Jaren, the other flight attendant, younger and quieter, shifted uncertainly and took a cautious step forward. "Maybe we should just double-check the manifest, Corrin," he offered, voice soft, uncertain. Corrin's head snapped toward him, eyes sharp with warning. "I said it's reassigned," he barked. "We follow orders, not discussions." Jaren stopped mid-step, his gaze dropping. Darian caught the entire exchange, noting Jaren's hesitation, the way his shoulders folded in. Around them, phones began rising discreetly, passengers filming, sensing the discomfort, the imbalance. The air grew tighter. Darian's mind worked quickly. He recognized the signs, escalation without justification, language crafted to trigger authority response, and most of all, the look in Corrin's eyes. Not annoyance, but anticipation. He wasn't reacting, he was executing. Then Corin's hand moved. 2 quick taps to his radio mic. It was subtle, almost meaningless to most. But Darian noticed. His breath caught, just for a second. That signal, he'd seen it before. In internal investigations tied to crew manipulation, it was used to mark incidents as pre-escalated, setting up documentation that later justified force. It meant a version of the story was already being written, and Darian wasn't the author. Darian slowly stood, not because he agreed, but because the moment demanded a recalibration. If this was a trap, he couldn't spring it on their terms. "I'm standing," he said calmly, eyes locked on Corin's. "Not because I've done anything wrong, but because I know what happens when the wrong narrative is written too quickly." Corin stepped back, smugness tugging at the edge of his mouth. "Marshal," he called out, gesturing down the aisle. "Escort this passenger out of first class. He's refused crew instructions." Darian turned slightly, just enough to see a man in uniform rise from his seat a few rows back. Standard issue, plainclothes air marshal, holster clipped to his belt. The man looked uncertain, caught between visible confusion and duty. He hadn't seen any resistance. "He didn't refuse anything," a passenger muttered from row 2. "He's been calm the whole time," another said, louder. Corin ignored them, motioning again. "Escort him. Now." Darian stepped into the aisle, his expression unreadable. He could feel the story being twisted in real time. A man refusing to give up his seat. A disturbance. A justification. But none of it was true, and the witnesses were watching. He adjusted his blazer as he turned, eyes brushing over the overhead compartments, then catching something, barely visible but unmistakable, in Corin's shirt pocket, a folded paper. The corner stuck out just enough for Darian to glimpse a red ink stamp. Priority Seating Acquisition. His stomach tightened. That wasn't a standard airline document. That was internal use, used when seats were shifted at the last moment, typically for dignitaries, corporate partners, or emergency protocols. Or bribes. As Darian moved into the aisle, a man behind him leaned forward nervously. Pale, mid-40s, wearing a business suit with a trembling voice. I'm sorry," he whispered just loud enough for Darian to hear. "That guy, Corin, he said if a seat came free up here, I could have it. I didn't know." Darian turned his head slightly. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "Stay seated." He faced forward again, processing the pattern now forming. This wasn't about procedure, it was about payoff, manipulation. His removal wasn't a fluke, it was manufactured. Darian took one final glance at Corin, whose smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Then he turned to the cabin, to the watching passengers, and simply said, "Keep your recordings going. You're going to need them." He wasn't just being removed, he was being provoked. This is the moment everything tilts. Corin shoved Darian hard, both hands slamming into his chest without warning. The force of it knocked Darian backward into the curtain partition, the rings above rattling on the metal rod. Gasps rippled through the cabin like a wave, snapping the atmosphere from mild confusion to immediate alarm. Darian's shoes dragged against the carpet as he caught himself with a hand on the nearby seat, straightening with a calmness that seemed impossible under the circumstances. His blazer had shifted slightly, exposing the corner of his ID badge beneath, but he didn't adjust it yet. He took a breath, steady and controlled, while all around him the silence filled with the heavy tension of a moment gone too far. The air marshal had taken a step forward out of instinct, caught off guard by the blatant aggression. His brows furrowed, but he hesitated, unsure which protocol to follow, assist the crew or intervene against one. Darian's mind raced, but not with panic. His objective, until now peaceful and internal, locked into something sharper: maintain control, defend his dignity, and document everything. This was no longer a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate move, a test, a setup. I asked him politely to leave the seat, Corin declared, raising his voice to the cabin. He refused. He became combative. The sentence hung in the air like a lie begging to be exposed. Darian turned his head, scanning the expressions of the passengers nearby. Disbelief, concern, and, most importantly, smartphones, already held up, some recording, some just beginning. He could hear the faint digital clicks of camera shutters and the quiet tones of recording notifications. He hadn't spoken yet. He didn't need to. The truth was already speaking through every lens aimed at Corin's outburst. In the reflection of the galley mirror, Darian caught a glimpse of something chilling. Corin's mouth curled just briefly into a smile. Not nervous, not apologetic, enjoying it. Darian straightened fully, brushing his blazer back into place with slow, deliberate movements. Then he saw it, just peeking out of Corin's right breast pocket, a folded document marked with a stamped title barely visible beneath the corner flap. Priority Seating Acquisition. His eyes narrowed, and his internal analysis shifted instantly. This wasn't a heat-of-the-moment power trip. This was planned, executed, possibly not even by Corin alone. "Excuse me," a voice murmured beside him. Darian turned slightly. A pale, balding man with a high forehead and trembling hands stepped closer from the row behind. I probably shouldn't say anything, but—" He lowered his voice to a whisper. "That attendant, he told me I might get upgraded to first class. Said if a seat opened up, he'd call me forward before takeoff. I didn't think—" Darian nodded once, not judging the man, just confirming his own suspicion. So that was the scheme. Manufacture a confrontation. Remove the seated passenger. Create an opening. "You did the right thing," Darian said softly. "Stay where you are. Keep your phone ready." Back in the aisle, Corin raised his voice again, trying to reassert the narrative. "This passenger is interfering with crew duties and ignoring lawful instructions. I am requesting assistance in removing him from first class." The marshal blinked. He looked at Darian, then at the other passengers, then back at Corin. His hesitation was visible now, a wobble in his professional stance. He hadn't expected this level of inconsistency, nor had he expected the multiple angles of digital evidence now documenting the entire incident. He said nothing yet, but his shift in posture was clear. This was no longer a situation where he could take Corin's word at face value. Darian took a small step forward, not aggressive, not defensive, just centered. He raised his voice, calm but firm. "Keep recording," he told the passengers. "No matter what happens." Corin's jaw twitched. He tapped his radio twice, click, click, then again. The sound triggered something deep in Darian's memory. That pattern. He had heard it during compliance investigations when rogue crew members used the double-tap signal to manipulate internal time-stamped logs, creating false flags in digital records. It was a loophole in some legacy communication systems, used specifically to frame incidents differently when reviewed after the fact. Darian's pulse quickened, but his hands stayed loose, calm, ready. "So that's how you're trying to cover it," he thought. "Not just violence, false documentation." He turned toward the marshal, who hadn't moved, and then toward the front of the cabin where the cockpit door remained sealed. Darian knew he'd need more than passengers to expose this. He needed to prepare the moment where truth would overpower narrative, something sharp, something strategic. The passengers, now fully aware they were watching something extraordinary unfold, sat in silence. A few began murmuring to each other. "He didn't do anything," one man whispered. "I saw it. He just stood up, and the guy shoved him." "Look at the guy's pocket," another said, pointing discreetly at Corin. "He's got some kind of seat form in there." In the corner of his eye, Darian spotted Jaren, the younger flight attendant, lingering near the galley. His posture was tense, his eyes flicking between Darian and Corin. He looked like he wanted to speak, but something, fear, Maybe loyalty kept him frozen. That, too, was data. Every hesitation, every glance, every silence. Corin, sensing his grasp on control slipping, stepped toward Darien again, but this time with more caution. He spoke quietly, lips tight. "Stand down, or I will make sure you never board this airline again." Darien tilted his head, voice still low. "I'm not the one who should be worried about ever boarding again." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise layered with facts. The marshal opened his mouth slightly as if to speak, but stopped again when Darien turned to the passengers once more. "This is not disorder. This is design." Corin stepped forward without warning and kicked Darien's leg hard, a sharp, deliberate strike meant to hurt, to humiliate, to force a reaction he could later twist into a lie. The impact jolted through Darien's body, forcing him to grip the nearest seat for balance. A ripple of outrage tore across the cabin. Passengers gasped, voices rose, and phones shot into the air like witnesses raised in protest. The air shifted instantly, thick with shock and disbelief. Darien felt the sting in his leg, but he refused to let the pain bend him. He straightened slowly, drawing a deep breath as he steadied himself, his face calm but his eyes sharp with determination. Corin immediately barked into his radio, his voice loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "Passenger in 1A is aggressive," he shouted, projecting false urgency while his hand trembled with the fear of losing control. His expression twisted into something desperate as he looked around, searching for anyone who might support his claim, but every camera captured the truth he was trying to bury. A man who had thrown the first kick, a man who had crossed the line. Jaren, standing a few rows behind, finally stepped forward. His voice cracked but carried strength. "He's lying," Jaren said loudly, pointing at Corin. "I saw everything. Mr. Crosswell didn't do anything." His hands shook, but he refused to back down. A few passengers murmured support, nodding, holding their phones steady. Corin turned toward Jaren with a glare sharp enough to cut through steel. "You say one more word," Corin hissed, stepping toward him with barely controlled rage, "and you're suspended." His tone was low, venomous, meant for Jaren alone. Jaren froze, trapped between fear and conscience, but his eyes stayed fixed on Darien, silently apologizing for the silence he was being forced into. Near the aisle, the air marshal lowered his gaze, suddenly avoiding Darien's eyes. That small movement told Darien everything he needed to know. The marshal had realized he had been misled, but was unsure how to correct course without violating protocol. Dramatic irony twisted the moment. Corin kept shouting about Darien's supposed aggression while the man being accused stood silently, breathing slowly, refusing to move even an inch toward violence. Then a sound sliced into the tension. The cockpit door opened just an inch. A shadowed figure inside called out, "Is he secured yet?" The voice was calm, almost routine, but the timing sent a cold thread of suspicion down Darien's spine. It suggested coordination. Someone else was expecting a situation that should never have existed in the first place. Passengers exchanged worried glances. Something larger was happening. Darien exhaled slowly, setting his stance the way he did before stepping into high-stakes negotiations. He lifted his chin and spoke clearly, his voice smooth and controlled. "Captain," he called out, "I request you step out and review the recordings. This has gone too far." Corin immediately shifted, blocking the narrow aisle with both arms spread wide. "No one moves," he barked, his voice louder and sharper than before. "Stay in your seats. No one approaches the cockpit." His breathing grew uneven, as if fear and anger were crashing into each other inside him. The captain hesitated behind the door, unable to see what was unfolding. The uncertainty only increased the chaos. Passengers started to shout now, no longer timid. "We saw him kick the man," someone yelled. "He's the one being aggressive," another added. The cabin filled with a chorus of indignation, a group of strangers suddenly united by the truth they had witnessed. But even with the truth rising around him, Corin clung to control like a sinking man grasping the last piece of driftwood. His eyes darted between Darien, the filming passengers, and the cockpit, trying to calculate how much longer he could maintain authority before it collapsed completely. Darien sensed the shift, the balance of power tipping, the fragile moment before something irreversible happened. He knew the truth was gathering momentum, but it wasn't enough yet. Not until he delivered the sentence that would cut the lie at its root. He straightened his shoulders, ignoring the throbbing pain in his leg, and locked eyes with the passengers, then with Corin. He lifted his chin with calm precision, ready to speak the one line that would ignite the turning point. This is where the sentence begins forming. Corin stepped forward, shoulders squared, his lips curled with smug confidence. His boots struck the floor with deliberate weight as he advanced toward Darien, the space between them narrowing like the tightening of a vice. The cabin, once filled with idle murmurs and mechanical whirring, had gone silent. Oxygen seemed thinner, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Passengers gripped their armrests. The air marshal, standing off to the side, shifted uneasily, unsure of where authority now rested. Corin's voice, though unspoken, radiated aggression. His eyes drilled into Darien's, searching for submission. But Darien didn't move. He didn't flinch, didn't blink. He simply stood there, arms loose at his sides, spine straight, chin slightly raised, not in defiance but in something far more unsettling to Corin: composure. The flight attendant's expectation of flustered retreat or verbal retaliation dissolved in that moment. Instead, Darien's presence consumed the aisle with quiet command. And then it happened. Darien's voice entered the silence like a blade sliding through velvet. Smooth, precise, devastating. If I step aside, your entire operation collapses. The sentence landed like a thunderclap. Audible gasps scattered across the cabin. The very air changed. Corin's face, once tight with control, began to shift. Confusion crept into his features, then panic. It was the first sign that he understood, even if vaguely, that the man before him wasn't what he assumed. Not a businessman begging for a seat, not a compliant target, but someone dangerous to the lie he was protecting. The passengers leaned in, alert. Some whispered, others tapped record again on their phones. The marshal blinked slowly, as if re-evaluating every prior assumption. A young man, 2 rows back, mouthed, "Who is he?" Corin opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His eyes darted, first to the cockpit, then to the marshal, then to the briefcase beside Darien's foot. His authority, so carelessly flung around moments ago, was now cracking. Darien reached down. Not fast, not in a way that suggested threat, but with the practiced control of someone who knew every step had to be deliberate, every movement calm. He clicked open the latches of his briefcase, the metallic sound cutting through the tension like static. His fingers found the document. The cabin lights caught the seal before the paper even cleared the leather edge, deep blue ink stamped into thick stock paper. He raised it. The passengers leaned closer. Corin's eyes widened as the words at the top came into focus. Emergency Flight Protocol Testing. Internal Compliance Review. And just above it, the unmistakable emblem of Veronis Systems. The name alone was a sledgehammer, recognized across the aviation world as the architects behind the most rigorous integrity and safety systems in commercial flight. "I wasn't just traveling," Darien said, his voice low but resonant, meant for everyone and no one in particular. "I was scheduled to evaluate this airline's readiness under stress, randomly assigned, without prior notice." Every passenger now hung on his words. The man with the camera in seat 2B whispered, "He's not kidding. I've heard of them. They test federal systems." The air marshal stepped forward, then paused. His stance subtly shifted, not toward Darien, but toward Corin, as if realizing the gravity of the mistake already made. Even he now understood that Darien's calm wasn't passive. It was authority restrained. Corin took a breath, about to argue, but his voice cracked. No words formed. The mask was slipping. "Why didn't you say something earlier?" he managed at last, trying to piece his role back together. Darian didn't even look at him. "I did," he said quietly, "just not with noise." Phones were still recording. The atmosphere had changed from confusion to clarity. This wasn't a passenger resisting crew instructions. This was a setup being unraveled thread by thread. The power Corrin once held bled out of the moment, inch by inch, word by word, until even the captain, still out of view, would be forced to choose which man stood for order and which for disruption. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, heavy, final. This was never about a seat. It was about exposing the cracks. The cockpit door swung open with a sharp metallic click. Captain Renner Jace stepped into the cabin expecting disruption. An unruly passenger, perhaps, or a routine misunderstanding that had escalated too far. But what met his eyes stopped him cold. Nearly every passenger in first class had their phones raised, cameras rolling, faces turned not toward the man supposedly causing trouble, but toward Corrin Vale, his senior flight attendant, whose expression was cracking under the scrutiny. And standing motionless at the center of it all was Darian Crosswell, calm, centered, and holding a sealed envelope with a symbol the captain knew well. The emblem of Veronis Systems, bold, blue, and unmistakable, glinted under the cabin lights. Renar's heart sank. He hadn't known Darian Crosswell would be aboard, let alone involved in the escalating conflict. The last internal memo from headquarters had warned that Veronis was running discrete evaluations on select flights before rolling out their new emergency response protocol. Now it was painfully clear. This wasn't just a dispute. This was a test, and his crew was failing. Darian didn't speak first. He let the image settle, the captain seeing the recording phones, the scattered gasps of passengers, the subtle tremble in Corrin's clenched jaw. When he did speak, his voice was calm, low, and precise. "Captain, I'd like to make a formal declaration of misconduct. Your lead attendant forcibly removed me from my assigned seat, physically assaulted me, and attempted to destroy federally relevant documentation." Renar blinked, glancing toward Corrin. "He's lying," Corrin snapped too quickly, his voice rising an octave. "He refused a lawful reassignment. I followed procedure. He wouldn't comply." Darian held up the envelope, unbroken seal intact, and turned it so the captain could see the header. Emergency Flight Protocol Testing. Internal Compliance Review. His voice remained steady. "I authored this document, and I was scheduled to observe crew behavior without interference. What's occurred here violates multiple FAA regulations." Behind him, the other attendant, Jaren, took a nervous step forward. "Captain, I tried to stop him," he said, his voice tight with guilt. "He told me not to interfere, but Mr. Crosswell's seat was on the manifest. He had 1A. I saw it myself." Corrin's head jerked toward Jaren, fury flashing in his eyes. "You're finished." But the threat landed hollow. Every eye was on the scene now, and the atmosphere shifted with the weight of truth. Captain Jace narrowed his eyes at Corrin. "Is this true?" Silence. Then, suddenly, Corrin lunged. His hand shot out toward Darian, grabbing the sealed envelope and wrenching it away before anyone could react. He crushed it in his palm, crumpling it with savage frustration. Passengers shouted. Phones zoomed in. The marshal, until now motionless, stepped forward fast. Darian didn't flinch. His posture didn't break. "Retrieve it," he said, not to the captain, but to the air marshal. That command, measured, direct, carried a gravity the marshal recognized. Without a word, he moved past Corrin, seized his wrist and pried the crumpled envelope from his grip. He held it out to Darian like returning a weapon to its rightful owner. Corrin stumbled back, red-faced and breathing hard. "You don't get to command my flight," he hissed. But he did. Everyone could feel it. The power had shifted, as silently and as irreversibly as a fault line snapping beneath the surface. The captain stepped in then, slowly but firmly, placing himself between Corin and Darien. "You're relieved," Renar said quietly. Corin's lips parted, but no words came. His authority drained from him like water slipping through cracks. Jaren turned to Darien. "I'm sorry," he said, chest rising and falling. "I should have spoken up earlier." "You just did," Darien replied, his tone not cold but heavy with implication. The captain turned to Darien. "We'll land early. I'll file the first report myself. Please, if you have any further documentation." Darien nodded and smoothed the envelope, now visibly creased but still intact. "I have everything you need, including recordings, but I believe there's something larger happening here." The captain's brows furrowed. "Larger?" Darien leaned in slightly. "This isn't the first flight I've observed irregular behavior on, and it won't be the last. I've been documenting patterns, crew manipulation, mid-flight seating changes, misconduct camouflaged as protocol." The words sank deep. Jaren looked stunned. The marshal stepped back, hand on his radio, already sensing this was going beyond passenger conflict. The tension didn't snap. It evolved. Outside the windows, the world continued to blur past at 30,000 feet. But inside, the control of the narrative had been claimed. No more silence. No more staged compliance. The captain stood taller, now seeing clearly. Corin slumped against the galley wall, mumbling faint justifications to no one who listened. Darien turned back to the cabin. Passengers still had their phones up, but now many had lowered them in silent respect. Some nodded to him. Others just stared, stunned, recognizing that something profound had just shifted before their eyes. The captain straightened. "Is there anything else you need, Mr. Crosswell?" Darien looked down at the envelope. Then he looked up. "Only one thing." "What's that?" "That this doesn't end in the air." And with that, he turned, handing the document back into the marshal's care as a record of everything that had been and everything that was still coming. The captain remained frozen for a breath, then slowly nodded. Behind them, Corin slid down into a jump seat, hands trembling. Jaren whispered, almost to himself, "Control has finally changed hands." Corin lunged without warning. His arm snapped forward, palm aimed squarely at Darien's shoulder, not to push him aside, but to provoke, to trap him in a reaction that could be filmed and misused. But Darien wasn't new to provocation. In one controlled motion, he shifted his weight to his left foot and pivoted. The shove met air. Corin stumbled forward with his own momentum, his arms flailing slightly before crashing awkwardly into the lap of a startled passenger in row 2. Gasps and the clatter of a dropped phone filled the air. "Get off me!" the passenger shouted, pushing Corin upright. The air marshal, who had been hesitating moments before, moved with precision now. He seized Corin's arms from behind and twisted them into a restraint hold. Corin didn't fight. He snarled. "You don't understand," he snapped, voice rising. "I have to finish the assignment." The cabin fell into stunned silence. Darien remained still, adjusting his cuff slowly. Inside, his heart beat like a war drum, but his face remained composed. He turned to the rows of passengers now fully alert, many still holding their phones up. "I want you all to know," he said evenly, voice low but firm, "that you've just recorded a felony and a cover-up attempt in progress." The marshal glanced at him with uncertainty, as if unsure who truly held authority here. Corin writhed slightly in his grip but stayed silent. Jaren, who had been watching from the galley with clenched fists, finally took a step forward. "That was the second time he tried to hit him," he said. "I saw the first, too. He's been acting strange since we boarded." Darien looked over his shoulder. "Strange how?" Jaren hesitated, lowering his voice. "Back at the gate, he got a sealed envelope. I saw him open it. After that, his whole mood changed. He kept checking the cockpit door, pacing. It's like someone flipped a switch. Darian narrowed his eyes. That was no accident. His thoughts raced. Protocol sabotage, intentional provocation, a planted envelope. Could someone have orchestrated this? Not just an upgrade scam, something larger. From the cockpit, the captain's voice boomed over the intercom. "Crew, prepare the cabin for emergency landing. We are initiating descent due to behavioral interference by crew." Passengers stirred with alarm, some whispering. A few applauded quietly. Darian turned back to Corin, who had gone pale, trembling now, his earlier aggression draining from him. "You don't understand," Corin muttered again, eyes darting. "I wasn't supposed to let him stay in that seat. It compromises the sequence." That word. Sequence. Darian's mind snapped back to the document in his briefcase. The evaluation protocol. He had been randomly assigned to observe this flight as part of an anonymous compliance test, one meant to check whether airlines honored emergency seating regulations, ethics procedures, and passenger treatment during high-pressure moments. No crew was supposed to know the identity of the evaluator, but Corin had targeted him anyway, unless he hadn't done it alone. Darian moved down the aisle as the plane jolted slightly, lights dimming as the descent began. He passed the rows of wide-eyed passengers, some offering nods of encouragement, others clearly trying to understand what kind of flight they had boarded. He reached the galley, opened his briefcase, and slid out the sealed protocol envelope. It was still intact. Then he turned to Jaren. "What did the envelope look like?" Jaren pointed. "Silver seal, slight tear on the corner. I thought it was just some crew briefing." Darian nodded slowly. "Did it have a symbol on it?" "Yeah," Jaren said. "A little triangle, with a black ring." Darian's jaw tightened. That wasn't Veronis. That was Raxencor, Veronis Systems' largest competitor, a firm notorious for its opaque dealings and high-level security contracts. If that symbol appeared on Corin's envelope, this incident had nothing to do with upgrades or personality clashes. This was a targeted attempt to compromise Darian's mission. He turned to the captain, who had stepped out halfway into the aisle after announcing the emergency descent. "Captain," Darian said, showing him the official seal on the protocol document. "Upon landing, that envelope Corin received must be secured and handled only by federal investigators. No internal staff, no airport security." The captain's eyes widened as he took in the seal, the document, and the crowd of passengers still filming from every angle. "Understood," the captain replied. "We'll make sure of it." A passenger called out from behind. "Hey, are we safe?" Darian turned halfway toward them. "You are now, but the danger was never turbulence." The plane vibrated again, cabin lights flickering faintly. Corin remained pinned beneath the marshal, whispering to himself like a man halfway between fear and fanaticism. Darian stepped into an open aisle space, placed one hand on a headrest to steady himself, and exhaled. He wasn't just being tested, he was being hunted. And whatever Corin was trying to finish, someone had planned it carefully, hoping Darian would lose his composure, act violently, or fail the ethical test his own company had created. But Darian hadn't broken. Not this time. The possibility of an internal conspiracy takes shape. Corin begins shouting that he has to finish the assignment, a cryptic statement that sends a cold wave through the cabin. Darian glances at the captain, both men realizing the threat is deeper than a single outburst. This flight is now a different kind of battlefield. He smirked, certain the act would go unchallenged, unaware the CEO had already calculated the perfect response, a single sentence that would shatter more than pride. If you believe disrespect always meets instant accountability, hit subscribe now, because justice speaks louder than kicks. The cabin jolted as the landing gear extended with a mechanical hum beneath the floor. Overhead lights dimmed to a softer hue, casting a pale glow on the anxious faces of passengers bracing for an emergency descent. The intercom had just clicked off after the captain's terse announcement. No one moved, no one spoke. The only sound was the subtle rustle of seatbelts being rechecked, phones clutched tighter, and the metallic clink of the cart drawer closing in the galley. Darian Crosswell didn't sit. Instead, he moved deliberately down the aisle with the sealed envelope pressed flat against his chest and his phone in the other hand. Screen dimmed but recording. His steps were steady, silent, as if the creaks of the aircraft floor panels bent to his control. Behind him, restrained in seat 1C, Corin Vale writhed slightly against the belt now wrapped around his torso and arms, eyes wild, breath uneven. "He doesn't get it," Corin muttered, lips barely moving. "He doesn't get that I need to complete the sequence." The words sent a wave of unease down the nearest row. A man across the aisle leaned back in alarm, pulling his son closer. A woman near the bulkhead whispered something under her breath. No one wanted to be near Corin anymore. Darian paused, turning his head just slightly, not enough to make eye contact with Corin, but enough for his voice to carry back with clarity. "Sequence?" he repeated, tone quiet but razor-edged. "What sequence?" Corin didn't answer, but the shift in his breathing, shallow, erratic, told Darian the phrase wasn't arbitrary. It was scripted, conditioned, a trigger. At the galley, Darian slid open the crew panel and began flipping through the preloaded compliance data on his device. Jaren stood nearby, nervously glancing between him and the cockpit. The marshal leaned against the divider, arms crossed now but no longer watching Darian with suspicion. Instead, he stood like a soldier, waiting for orders. Darian's fingers paused on the screen. He glanced at the envelope again, narrowing his eyes. A small metallic sticker had partially peeled from its backside, nearly invisible to the casual eye. But Darian was trained to notice what others didn't. He rotated the envelope under the galley light until it caught a glint. A stylized insignia, interlocking hexagons forming a fragmented circle. He knew that emblem. Raxon Core Solutions, the competitor. The implications came fast, cold, and surgical. This wasn't a rogue attendant trying to abuse power for a free upgrade. This was planted. Darian's jaw set, his thoughts racing as he tapped the intercom and requested to speak with the captain privately. But before his thumb left the panel, the cockpit door opened halfway and the captain's voice slid through like a thin knife. "I saw you signal. Speak." Darian held up the envelope and met the captain's eyes with full authority. "There's an emblem here, Raxon Core. This wasn't a random incident. It's industrial sabotage. You need to isolate this envelope upon landing and request federal containment." The captain didn't blink. He stared at Darian for a long second, then nodded once and retreated behind the door, muttering something to his co-pilot. The door shut with a hiss. Behind him, Corin began rocking slightly, chanting under his breath again. "Sequence. Sequence. Failure point must be visual." Passengers were watching now, not out of curiosity, but for comfort. Darian's presence had shifted something in the atmosphere. Even those who didn't understand what was unfolding had aligned themselves behind him. A few rows back, the father who had been filming whispered, "He's not just some passenger." The plane shook violently, briefly, caught in turbulence. A few screams pierced the silence, but Darian didn't flinch. His palm braced against the galley wall until the aircraft leveled again. He turned to the marshal. "When we land, you secure the envelope. Do not let airport security take it." The marshal nodded once. "Understood." Then Darian raised his voice just slightly, directing it to the passengers. "This flight isn't over, but it is under control. Whatever you've witnessed, whatever you've recorded, hold on to it. Don't delete anything. Don't hand it to anyone unless they show a federal seal. Your cooperation may decide whether this aircraft's future procedures are written by truth or by someone trying to bury it." A ripple of approval moved through the cabin. Some nodded. A few whispered, "Yes, sir." One young man even turned his phone screen outward, showing the recording still running. Jaron stepped forward, his face pale but steady. "Mr. Crosswell, that envelope Corin had? He got it from a man at the gate. Didn't see his face clearly, but it looked official. Corin changed after reading it, like someone flipped a switch." Darian took a slow breath. "Then that envelope is more dangerous than we thought." The plane began its descent arc, the nose dipping slightly as pressure increased. The sound of the flaps adjusting roared through the cabin, echoing like waves in a cave. As Darian walked back down the aisle, passengers watched him the way soldiers might watch a general, quiet, focused, and unwavering. He reached for the headrest in front of him and gripped it tightly, lowering himself into a seat, envelope clutched under his arm like classified intel. Outside the window, runway lights bled into view. His mind ran calculations, not for escape, but for strategy, for containment, for war. The captain's voice came over the speaker again. "Ladies and gentlemen, final approach." The hum of landing gear locked in place. Darian didn't blink. He wasn't thinking about safety vests or oxygen masks. He was thinking about names, badges, chains of command. Because whoever had tried to use Corin Vale to sabotage this protocol didn't expect Darian to survive with composure intact. They expected panic, maybe even rage, but not this. As the wheels braced for touchdown and the first bump of tarmac rocked the fuselage, Darian tightened his grip and whispered to himself, barely audible over the rumble. "The real confrontation begins after the landing." The wheels struck the runway with a deep, vibrating jolt that snapped passengers upright in their seats. Nervous applause erupted across the cabin, a reflexive gesture of relief after the tense descent. But Darian Crosswell didn't clap. He didn't even flinch. His eyes remained sharp, scanning the aisle like a soldier calculating an extraction. His mind had already moved beyond the landing. The danger wasn't turbulence, it was interference, and it was about to step through the aircraft door. As the brakes hissed and the aircraft rolled to a halt, blue and red lights flashed against the cabin windows. Gasps and whispers flickered through the passengers like sparks across dry grass. To the average traveler, the arrival of airport security was a sign of justice arriving. But Darian saw it differently. He leaned slightly toward the window and narrowed his gaze. The flash pattern was wrong. These weren't federal investigators. They were airport security, units that, in his experience, reported directly to the airline's internal chain. If Astroflight wanted to spin this narrative, these men could bury the truth before a single federal badge arrived. The seatbelt sign hadn't even turned off before the front cabin door hissed open. The captain stood near the threshold, solemn, his posture stiff with internal conflict. He turned back, giving a silent nod. Two uniformed officers began boarding, walking in with the quiet confidence of men who thought they were in control. But before they could take 2 steps into first class, Darian was already moving. He stepped into the aisle with unwavering calm, raising one hand politely but firmly. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice low but commanding, "please pause." The lead officer blinked, surprised. "Sir, we've been asked to secure the situation." "I understand," Darian interrupted smoothly. "However, before anything is touched, I need to identify myself." He reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek identification wallet, flipping it open. Darian Crosswell, Chief Integrity Architect, Veronis Systems. The badge gleamed under the cabin lights. The second officer's eyebrows twitched upward. The title alone was enough to make most security teams pause. But it was Darian's presence, his steady eye contact, his complete composure, that truly froze them. The first officer hesitated. "What exactly is your role here, Mr. Crosswell?" Darian didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured calmly toward the back of the cabin. "I'm the reason this plane didn't descend into a scandal midair. I'm also the reason your internal compliance department is about to face federal review. So again, I ask that you do not touch a single item until statements are properly recorded." The cabin fell into a reverent hush. Jaren, the younger flight attendant who had tried to intervene earlier, suddenly stepped forward, clutching something in his hand. His fingers trembled as he held it out. This is the envelope Corin received before boarding," he said, glancing nervously between the officers and Darien. He opened it, and then everything changed. Darien took the envelope carefully, but his focus shifted. Out of the corner of his eye, he caught a detail most would miss. One of the officers, broad-shouldered, mid-40s, a clipped accent in his speech, had his badge fastened upside down on the lapel. It was subtle, but to Darien it was a warning bell. That specific misplacement was something he used to teach in integrity seminars, a quiet red flag, often used by impersonators or decoys posing as authority figures in crisis drills. Darien's expression didn't change, but his voice cooled. "Officer," he said, pointing to the man with the misaligned badge, "can you provide the name of your shift supervisor?" The man stiffened. His jaw flexed and his eyes darted toward the terminal outside. "Now, please," Darien pressed, his voice sharper now, tinged with steel. "Either you produce your credentials, or we treat this as attempted obstruction of a compliance review." Before the man could answer, the marshal, who had watched silently until now, stepped forward and placed a hand on the officer's arm. "I'll take him for verification," the marshal said. There was no protest. The man allowed himself to be escorted out, but the unease rippled behind him like smoke. Around them, phones remained raised. Passengers who once thought they were watching a minor altercation were now documenting a layered, unfolding investigation. The weight of the moment began to shift. The authority Corin once held, the silence he'd enforced, all of it was now replaced by the growing roar of public truth. Darien turned to face the passengers. "Everyone who recorded footage, please hold it secure. This isn't over." Cheers and murmurs of support rippled through the rows. One elderly man gave Darien a small nod of admiration. A college student in row 3 whispered to his neighbor, "He's not just a passenger, is he?" No one answered. They didn't need to. The energy in the cabin had changed. The other officer, still legitimate, approached Darien with renewed respect. "We'll begin collecting statements immediately, sir. You'll have the floor first." Darien nodded and stepped into the aisle, one hand lightly gripping the headrest of seat 1A, the seat that had started it all. He glanced once more toward the open door, beyond which the terminal pulsed with more uniforms, more cameras, more stories waiting to form. He took a breath. "This landing is not the end. It is the opening statement." The briefing room door slammed shut with a finality that made the air feel heavier. Darien Croswell sat perfectly upright at the steel-lined table, the fluorescent lights above humming faintly as if echoing the tension gripping the room. Across from him, 2 federal investigators in navy jackets exchanged glances before flipping open thick manila folders. Their eyes were sharp, movements calculated. No greetings, no small talk. This was not a courtesy review, and this was a federal inquiry ignited mid-flight by a single coded transmission from the captain, who had flagged a Category 7 compliance breach, and Darien had triggered it. At the far end of the room, restrained by a wrist lock to a reinforced chair, Corin Vale slumped forward, the bravado drained from his posture. The once commanding flight attendant who had kicked Darien from first class now looked like a discarded puppet. His eyes avoided contact, flicking nervously between the floor tiles and the blank monitor mounted on the far wall. Every breath he took was shaky, like he was finally realizing the scale of the fire he had helped light. The lead investigator, a graying man with a clipped mustache and a stare like cold glass, nodded toward the digital screen. "Play it." A second officer tapped the control panel. The footage began. The room watched in silence as the video played back every crucial moment. The shove into the partition curtain, the aggressive radio call falsely accusing Darien of resisting orders, the blatant kick to his shin. And finally, the moment Darien stood calmly, raising a sealed compliance document stamped with the Verones Systems emblem. Corin flinched when his own voice played aloud. Refused instructions. Aggressive subject. Escalate security. Each phrase now burned as evidence of manipulation. He tried to speak once, but the investigator held up a hand without looking. Quiet, he said, not with anger, but finality. Darien leaned forward slightly, folding his hands. The behavior wasn't random. It was coordinated. I'm requesting this review include sabotage as a motive. One of the agents raised a brow. Sabotage? Darien reached into his satchel, not hurried, not hesitant, and placed a small evidence bag on the table. Inside was the folded envelope Corin had received before takeoff. On its back, nearly invisible under dim lighting, was a metallic security seal marked with an emblem. The room leaned forward. That symbol, Darien said calmly, belongs to Raxon Core Solutions. They're a direct competitor of Verones Systems. We're both up for the same federal aviation contract next week. If they can discredit our integrity protocols, they win by default. Tension climbed like a slow elevator. One investigator reached for his tablet, quickly pulling up interagency reports. His brows furrowed. Raxon Core did file a protest against Verones last month, claimed your system was manipulatable by hostile passengers. Darien nodded once. And now I'm that example. On paper. That envelope? It's a trigger. Not for violence. For perception. All they needed was a video of me losing control. The dramatic irony pressed inward like heat. Corin, who'd assumed he was just playing enforcer for an upgrade scam, had unknowingly walked into a trap built by far higher forces. His fingers twitched in the cuff. His voice cracked. I didn't know. No one told me what it was really for. The agent didn't look at him. Instead, he turned to Darien. You want to press charges? Darien held his gaze. Yes, but not just against the man holding the envelope. He leaned forward, each word deliberate. I want the truth traced, not just the person holding the envelope. The lead investigator's pen hovered above his pad, motionless. The statement hung in the air like thunder before a storm. Then, almost as if compelled by the weight of it, the agent nodded slowly. Darien sat back, letting the silence settle into something firm and undeniable. Corin lowered his head, the gravity of betrayal finally crushing him. And in that moment, every player in the room understood. The attack had never been about one man. It had been a test of restraint, of ethics, of how easily the truth could be weaponized. The door to the maintenance corridor slammed open with a metallic thud, startling even the most seasoned officers. Two agents in dark navy aviation jackets stormed into the narrow hallway, their footsteps echoing against the cold tile. They moved quickly, rounding the corner to the inconspicuous office door nestled between a janitor's closet and a defunct vending machine. The nameplate read Skybridge Logistics, a dummy corporation Darien had flagged just hours ago. The lead officer stepped forward, rapped on the door twice, then kicked it open. Inside, fluorescent lights flickered above a space that looked barely used, until one opened drawer revealed communication logs, transit receipts, and a silver folder stamped with an emblem that made Darien's pulse tighten, a half-obscured Raxon Core seal. Darien stood behind the officers now, silent, scanning the space with methodical precision. His mind wasn't on revenge, it was on validation. Every instinct he'd suppressed during the chaos on Flight 918 now found confirmation in paper, print, and proof. A stack of correspondence lay spread on the desk. One page, clearly labeled, caught everyone's eye. Sequence trigger, Crosswell. The words hit like a punch to the ribs. It was the phrase Corin had muttered repeatedly in his panic. Darien's jaw clenched as he picked up the document, eyes narrowing. This wasn't a spontaneous abuse of power. This was an orchestrated operation with a target, him. "What does it say?" asked one of the officers, peering over Darian's shoulder. Darian didn't answer immediately. He skimmed the page, then flipped it to find more clipped notes. Behavioral triggers, escalation points, expected reaction times. One chilling line stood out. Primary objective: provoke Crosswell to break protocol on record. Use footage as grounds to disqualify Veronis Systems' leadership from federal clearance consideration. His voice was steady when he finally spoke. "They didn't want to hurt me," he said, placing the folder back on the table. "They wanted me to fail myself. On camera." The officer swallowed hard, then reached for his radio. "We're going to need the federal ethics team. This just crossed the line." Darian nodded, but didn't relax. His objective had just changed again. This wasn't only about vindication. It was about protecting the very aviation system he'd spent a decade shaping. If Veronis fell under this sabotage, every protocol under review could be delayed, altered, or corrupted. Raxencor's gain wouldn't just be market share, it would be lives. He stepped toward a side desk where another folder lay open, half obscured under a bag of disposable gloves. Inside were employment correspondence logs between Raxencor and a pseudonym, K. Vale. Darian tapped the folder. "This is the incentive," he murmured. "They promised him more than just an upgrade scheme." Another agent pulled out a secondary sheet of paper detailing a proposed permanent management placement upon successful execution. The word execution made the room chillier. One of the agents looked to Darian with wide eyes. "They offered him a career," he whispered. "He thought this would make him." Darian nodded once. "Instead, it will be what breaks him." The agents began bagging the documents for chain of custody preservation, but Darian remained still, breathing deep, counting the seconds between the confirmations. His mind darted back to the plane, to the first shove, the flash of Corin's smirk in the galley mirror, the tremble in the captain's voice when Darian presented the Veronis seal. He had seen the signs. He had stayed composed. And now it was paying off. A knock sounded from the hallway. The captain from Flight 918 stepped in, removing his hat respectfully. "Mr. Crosswell," he began, "I've submitted my full statement. And I should have acted sooner. I saw the envelope. I knew something didn't sit right." Darian gave him a small nod. "It's not about how fast you move. It's about whether you move at all." Across the room, another officer looked up from a passenger's submitted video and said, "Sir, we now have multiple confirmations. What you described was accurate down to the minute. They all filed recordings. Dozens." "And the badge?" Darian asked. "Confirmed. The one officer on the tarmac had falsified credentials. He's in holding now. We're verifying who sent him." Darian's fingers curled slightly at his side, but his face remained composed. "That makes it an organized attempt to suppress evidence." A silence settled as the weight of the truth filled every inch of the room. One of the agents signed a form and handed it off to a courier waiting by the door. The courier slipped on gloves, then sealed the evidence bag with a tamper-proof clip. He turned to the lead investigator. "First action orders signed. We're moving on the Raxencor executives listed here." "Good," Darian said, his voice low but clear. "Let every step leave a record. Let every lie lead back to its architect." The captain watched Darian in silence for a moment. "You knew from the moment he shoved you, didn't you?" Darian's eyes didn't flinch. "I didn't know who, but I knew the design." He turned back toward the whiteboard where agents had begun sketching out a timeline. A red marker had just been drawn beneath a line that read, "Gate A, initial target confirmed." A quiet buzz spread through the room as more officials were notified. The air had changed, no longer tense with ambiguity, but sharp with purpose. Darian leaned in toward the documents again, scanning for what would come next, not just for him, but for every system he'd sworn to protect. And as the final folder was sealed, and the first set of subpoenas dispatched, he murmured almost to himself, but loud enough for the room to hear. Every plan built on deception collapses under truth. The first voice to break the silence wasn't Darian's. It was the bailiff, calling the room to order as the judge entered. The courtroom, packed with reporters and aviation officials, hummed with anticipation. But Darian Croswell didn't look up at the crowd. He sat still, spine straight, eyes focused only on the stand and the evidence folder in front of him. His objective was clear now, not just to win, but to show, methodically, without spectacle, that integrity could destroy sabotage. He adjusted the single button on his black suit, its simplicity matching his mindset. No dramatic flair, only truth. Across from him sat the defense team for Astroflight, and, adjacent, the legal counsel for Corin Vale. The latter stared ahead, pale and visibly shaken, no longer the smug figure from the aircraft. The defense opened confidently, arguing that Corin had acted independently under momentary misjudgment. They leaned heavily into the narrative of a misinterpreted policy reassignment, painting Darian as an unfortunate victim of procedural confusion, not malice. But the narrative began to crumble when Darian's attorney stood and presented the first piece of evidence, a hard copy of the internal instruction sheet recovered from the dummy office linked to Raxon Core Solutions. The document bore the ominous heading, Sequence Trigger, Croswell. Audible gasps scattered through the courtroom. The judge narrowed his eyes. The prosecutor handed the judge a copy. Your Honor, we submit that this document was delivered to the flight attendant prior to the incident, detailing precise actions to provoke Mr. Croswell and discredit his conduct on record. The defense scrambled, objecting, but the judge overruled. I'll allow it. Next came the communication logs, time-stamped, location-tagged, and encrypted. One message from the office Corin had visited before boarding read, Ensure the subject is perceived as combative. The camera will do the rest. Tension thickened as witness testimony began. First, Jaron took the stand. Hands trembling, voice soft, he recounted the moment Corin received the envelope at the gate. He changed after that, Jaron said, eyes flicking toward Corin. He kept checking his watch, mumbling about sequence timing. I knew something was off, but I didn't know how deep it went. Then the air marshal testified. His tone was measured, but there was a visible unease in his jaw. I was instructed to remove Mr. Croswell based on what the attendant claimed were real-time threats, he explained. But the footage, it told a different story. Mr. Croswell remained composed, controlled. The threat was never from him. Darian watched, expression unreadable. Every word confirmed what he already knew. This was never an accident. This had been orchestrated, piece by piece. Then came the captain. The silence was heavy as he sat. I should have acted sooner, he said, eyes down. But I've flown long enough to know when something feels engineered. That envelope didn't belong in my manifest log. And when I saw that document Mr. Croswell held up, I knew we were all being tested, and not just on compliance, on conscience. But it was the former Raxon Corps executive who shattered the defense. Brought in under subpoena, the man looked worn down by guilt. He admitted under oath that Raxon Corps had implemented unofficial operations to sabotage Veronis Systems' reputation. We were losing the federal bid, he said, and someone high up thought discrediting Darian Croswell personally would invalidate the safety protocol he authored. The defense objected again, but the damage had been done. The judge leaned forward. You're saying this attack was systemic, not isolated? Yes, the executive answered quietly. It was never about a seat. It was about making the public believe Mr. Croswell couldn't be trusted in a crisis. Silence followed. No one moved. Then the judge looked directly at Darian. Mr. Croswell, do you have anything to say before I recess for deliberation? Darian rose slowly. He didn't scan the room or raise his voice. He simply lifted his head and said, Integrity is either constant or it is counterfeit. There is no in-between. The room fell still. The judge nodded, then gavelled the courtroom into recess. His words shook the public narrative, transforming him from victim into a national symbol of controlled strength. A single sentence can break more than a nose. It can break a system of lies. The judge's voice had barely faded when the courtroom doors opened, and news of the verdict burst into the world like an overdue storm. Every major outlet began broadcasting headlines. Raxon Corps executives found guilty in sabotage plot, Astra, flight ordered to overhaul compliance, and, most notably, the Crosswell Integrity Standard, now federal law. Darian Crosswell stood at the press podium days later, but he didn't feel triumphant. He felt responsible. Behind him, rows of aviation officials, journalists, federal observers, and industry executives filled the National Transportation Ethics Hall, a modern structure of glass and steel built on the idea of accountability. The ceiling reflected the polished mahogany floor where Darian now stood, a single microphone angled to his chest. His posture was precise, his suit simple black. His hands, no longer shaking as they once had aboard Astraflight 918, rested firmly on the edge of the podium. He didn't look around for applause. He didn't wait for ceremony. He spoke plainly. This began with a flight that should have been ordinary. It ended with a question: do we protect people, or do we protect power? His voice rang through the space, low, steady, and undeniable. Cameras flashed. To Darian's right stood Captain Roran Hale, the very pilot who had once hesitated behind a cockpit door, uncertain of who to believe. Today, Hale's expression held nothing but quiet respect. Beside him stood Jaron Tave, no longer a junior flight attendant, but now the lead compliance trainer for Astraflight's National Crew Conduct Program. His hands were clasped, his gaze steady on Darian like a student watching a mentor. Darian continued. No badge should be forged to justify silence. No envelope should arrive with instructions to compromise truth. And no passenger, regardless of what they look like, should ever be asked to step aside to make room for influence. A hush settled over the room. He glanced toward the rows of journalists scribbling his every word. He could see it in their faces. This wasn't just news. It was change. He turned, revealing for the first time the plaque behind him. Etched into the steel was the official federal adoption of a new code, the Crosswell Integrity Standard. A set of nationwide policies that restructured crew authority, realigned escalation protocol, introduced third-party auditing, and implemented live in-flight compliance triggers linked to federal oversight. Jaron was first to speak when the ceremony concluded. "I've replayed that flight in my head every night," he said quietly to Darian. "What would have happened if you hadn't stayed calm, if you hadn't said that sentence?" Darian looked at him, his eyes tired but unwavering. Then none of this would exist. Behind them, digital screens displayed real-time testimonials from crew members undergoing retraining, from pilots acknowledging missteps, and even from passengers who had once felt powerless. Now, they had names for what they experienced. Systems were finally being built around the very moments that used to slip through the cracks. A sudden flurry of questions erupted as reporters stepped closer. "Mr. Crosswell, how does it feel, knowing the airline that failed you now thanks you publicly? Do you think Astraflight truly understands the damage caused? Will you ever fly with them again?" Darian didn't dodge. He answered each with clarity but without ego. "They failed me, but they're fixing what others ignored. I respect that. They've acknowledged the truth. That's more than most. And to the final question, flying with them again? I already have, unannounced, twice." Gasps moved through the room. "They didn't know," he added, "and they passed." Captain Hale smiled faintly. Jaron lowered his eyes, visibly moved. Later that day, as the crowd filtered out and cameras packed up, Darian remained alone in the hall for a few quiet minutes. He approached the edge of the marble stage where the original crew manifest from Flight 918 now hung in a glass frame, each name printed beside a colored indicator of whether they upheld protocol that day. Next to Corin Vale's name, red, permanently disqualified. Next to Jaren's, green, promoted, acknowledged. Darian rested his hand briefly on the edge of the case. In that moment, he wasn't a CEO, not a whistleblower, just a man who didn't step aside. Footsteps echoed lightly behind him. A reporter, one who hadn't asked anything earlier, stood with a notepad pressed to his chest. "Mr. Crosswell, that sentence you said when Corin kicked you from first class, do you remember the exact words?" Darian turned, face unreadable. Then, slowly, his expression softened. "I said it because it was true," he answered. His voice was calm, his gaze direct. "If I stepped aside, their entire scheme would have succeeded." The reporter didn't write it down. He just nodded once, as if understanding the full weight. Darian walked past him, past the plaque, past the cameras now dark. His steps echoed into silence. His journey began with humiliation, but ended in transformation, of systems, of accountability, and of truth itself. Some flights land harder, only so justice can land stronger. He kicked a CEO and froze as one calm, commanding sentence broke his nose and left the cabin stunned. If you believe dignity can strike harder than fists, subscribe now, because justice lands with precision. The story you just watched is fictional. It highlights racism, abuse of authority, and the power of composure and truth in confronting prejudice. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, accountability, and treating every passenger with dignity and respect.